When many people think of Brooklyn, or the neighborhood of Williamsburg in particular, the first thing they think about is cool. Like the neighborhood itself or the borough itself is cool. Well, I'm here today to tell you a little bit about the history of Williamsburg in particular, and tell you why it used to be cool. I mean, it still is, but it used to, too. But anyway, let's dig into what makes Williamsburg such a unique, historic, and important neighborhood in Brooklyn. And I think the first thing to call out is that Williamsburg itself used to be its own city. Very briefly, it was part of the town of Bushwick, and then eventually was a village itself, and then was briefly a part of the city of Brooklyn before becoming part of the city of New York in 1898 when the boroughs merged together, or joined together to form the city as we know it today. But what really I think is fascinating about the early to recent history of Williamsburg, and what really makes it so cool, is its incredible amount of diversity. Williamsburg has a wide variety of people, and it's certainly not to pigeonhole, but I think there are three main groups that really tell the story about the neighborhood. And those are the Hasidic Jews, who live primarily in the southern part of Williamsburg, kind of south of Division Street, in what some people will refer to as South Williamsburg. Then there is a large Puerto Rican community just north of them in the south side part of the neighborhood, not to be confused with southern Williamsburg. But that community apparently moved in very regularly for a lot of jobs that were at the Navy Yard when the Navy Yard was still very operational. So it's a large Puerto Rican community, essentially south of Grand Street in Williamsburg. There's even part of Graham Avenue is renamed Avenue of Puerto Rico. The other large community that is still quite vibrant today in Williamsburg is the Italians. Now, most Italian New Yorkers moved here quite a long time ago, more down in the Little Italy area of Manhattan, or eventually up into the Bronx as well. But there's a significant and still current community of them here in Williamsburg, more on the side of Eastern Williamsburg, not to be confused with East Williamsburg. And if you keep hearing me make those kind of qualifiers, that's because Williamsburg is a absolutely enormous neighborhood, which is the next thing I think that needs to be called out. In the most recent census, the neighborhood was about 150,000 people, which is more than most modern small American cities, just in one neighborhood, just in New York. But it has continued to grow because it has so many distinct parts. So there is northern Williamsburg, the south side, southern Williamsburg, Eastern Williamsburg, and East Williamsburg. And East Williamsburg is just like its own neighborhood, but some people claim that it isn't. Some people it's like, no, that's either Williamsburg or it's Bushwick. You can argue semantics down in the comments because, as you might not know, but as every New Yorker needs to know, there are no official neighborhood boundaries in New York. So it is whatever the people who live there believe it is, and it is often whatever the real estate agents who want to be able to sell you on a place think it will sell better as. But down to the crux of things, when did Williamsburg become cool? Why has it stopped being as cool? And how you should really think of the neighborhood going forward. Now, Williamsburg got cool in the same way that Soho and the West Village and the East Village got cool 10, 20 years, even 30 years before Williamsburg did. And that is, of course, because for a time it was one of the more affordable neighborhoods in the city. Williamsburg went through a very heavy decline in the 1970s and 1980s, as many parts of New York did, but I think you could say that it was felt acutely in Williamsburg, given that it's an Arab borough, given its large immigrant population, and given the sad state of the bridge that connects it to the city as well, made it very difficult for the neighborhood to thrive as it saw its industrial waterfront really flee. So you're seeing now behind you built all these modern glassy towers, but a lot of these buildings used to be warehouses, used to be factories. We won't build it in today's episode, but closer down towards the bridge, there was a huge Domino sugar factory, which if you've been down to that part of Williamsburg recently, has been converted into a park and new residences out of both new and converted buildings. But when a neighborhood is inexpensive and times are hard in a city, who likes to flock to a neighborhood? Artists. So Williamsburg became a mecca for underground, struggling artists trying to make their living in New York and trying to make a name for themselves. And they were able to do that in many ways. Now, I won't go about naming artists. I'm not the biggest art person or critic myself, but these are the kinds of things that give a neighborhood its coolness. It's the same thing that happened in Soho many decades before. The problem is, and the reason why I often refer to Williamsburg as Soho East, is because as a neighborhood becomes cool, other people who like cool things, but have the money that the people who create those cool things often don't have, flooded the neighborhood. Now, those initial waves of gentrification are not necessarily all bad. I'm never against new housing being built and people moving into new neighborhoods, as long as you respect the cultures that are there and you partake in the community that exists there. And I think a lot of early gentrifiers fall along that mindset. Certainly not everybody, but to call them all out as being a negative force, I think it's really quite a NIMBY position at its heart. And what ends up happening in a neighborhood like Williamsburg is that you get this era, this period where it has enough of the old, rugged artsiness and enough of the new money coming in that everyone starts to see it as cool. And that's what happened in Williamsburg through the 90s and particularly into the 2000s, and especially through the huge pop of indie music in New York. Williamsburg rather, just became a hive for so much that was going on in the city. But not all good things can stay. And unfortunately, Williamsburg continued to get more and more and more developed, and I think the final nail in its coffin was the rezoning it received under Mayor Michael Bloomberg in 2005. This essentially led to all the glass tower construction and all the growth in Williamsburg. And again, I'm not necessarily against that. New York needs more housing and we should be building it everywhere we can get it. Should we be building glassy high-rises in an era of climate change right next to the water for rich people? I think we can do a lot better than that. But some housing is better than no housing, and neighborhoods like Williamsburg and Long Island City, to name a couple, have really, I think, pioneered that in recent years in New York. And I'd love to see more of it in more areas, maybe done better, maybe more tastefully, learning from the mistakes that Williamsburg made. Because the mistakes that Williamsburg has made is many. I lived in Williamsburg briefly from 2015 to 2016, when it was certainly past its peak cool, but definitely still had a vibe that I really enjoyed. And I have to say, it just did not last. At the end of my year living there, a brand new Apple store opened up, as well as a Whole Foods. And now I'm usually not against supermarkets being built in cities either, because so many cities across America have food desert issues. But this Whole Foods got built literally around the corner from a food town. Is the food town a better supermarket than the Whole Foods? No. It was adequate and clean, and I always got a decent meal there. But having residents feel like they need the fancy supermarket for the wealthy people to open up, to me, is a sure sign that the gentrification is going too far. And to me, that's what Williamsburg is now. And I think Williamsburg is still on the bit of a precipice. Don't get me wrong, this is still a neighborhood that I love. I go there pretty often. It's a great place to hang out. There's good concert venues, although RIP Knitting Factory soon. And there's still a lot of great divey bars and cool restaurants, and there's still more than enough culture there to make Williamsburg an important part of New York and a very important part of Brooklyn. What I hope doesn't happen in Williamsburg is what has happened in Soho, where it's gone hyper gentrification, and there's just like, high-end department stores all over the place, and, Pradas and Uniqlos and things like that. I really do hope Williamsburg can maintain a bit of its sense of coolness, but let me know down below. Do you think it's cool?